All right, and we are back. This is going to be The Revenge of the Object, Part 2, which is going to involve a bit of critique. Now, first off, before I start, I want to say I realize there's a mess behind me, the clean your room joke. But for Part 3 of The Revenge of the Object, I am doing an art piece. And the art piece concerns the object and the object's screens. So we know that when it comes to subjects, especially through psychoanalysis or ideology critique, it's known that there are screens on reality. And screens on their own are fascinating. We got a green screen right here. So the screen is a fascinating concept because the screen is what allows certain decisions to be made. The screen itself makes decisions on what's allowed to pass through it and what it blocks. So the purpose of just a basic window screen is to let air through, but to block, bugs from flying into your house. The screen of fantasy is similar in that it allows certain aspects, certain signs in a mythic sense. It allows certain aspects or certain signs to get through in order to transform them into something else. So the screen, which I like as it's a little bit more than an analogy because it's meant literally, but it allows certain things through while blocking others. So a green screen, a screen door, the screen of fantasy, and when we're talking here about the revenge of the object, part of it is just to say that the object itself screens, or the object itself has its own screens. This is not partial only to subjectivities, but that objects themselves screen. So this is going to be, like I said, Revenge of the Object Part 2, and we're going to get into a little bit of critique today. And I've been thinking we would never be in this subject-object duality mess if we just did Whitehead's metaphysics instead of, a Kantian or a modern metaphysics. Whitehead has subjects, but a subject is anything that decides with respect to an actual occasion, which just means that something happens to it. And I wasn't planning on talking about this. Maybe I have to go back to Whitehead because it's been probably 2 or maybe even 3 years. But for Whitehead, a subject is anything to which an occasion happens. So even down to electrons bumping into each other, we have a case for subjectivity. And what we normally, in the Western tradition at least, call a subject, Whitehead has a term for that as well. It's a superject, which is an emergent property out of a whole bunch of subjects, which is kind of what our body is. It makes many decisions, some conscious, some unconscious, and then we become the superject. So maybe we should return to that again soon because I'm rusty on it. I haven't read Process and Reality for a while. But I have said in some cases that Whitehead finished metaphysics in my mind. And we don't need another one. It's clean, it's imminent, it's good. And certain, for me at least, certain actual occasions do make it quite difficult for me these days to sit down and plan out one of these episodes, as I mentioned last time. So in fits and starts, I'm going to be able to do this one and the next one. The whole artwork for the next episode, I'm going to be able to fix or finish, hence the mess behind me, but I'm going to be able to finish it when the kid goes to grandma's house for the weekend and I have some time to paint. Anyway, we have some ground to cover first. Bit of critique, bit of a look at Baudrillard, and we're going to look more at the revenge of the object. That's today's task. So what we're doing here is interrogating the distinction, which is particularly Western and particularly modern. Descartes, Hume, Kant. Not so much Spinoza. If we had begun with Spinoza, we might have a different look at the world. But as it is, the duality between subject and object. And there's a way to say, you know, we're looking at a binary, and the way to break a binary could be to say, oh no, these are poles of a spectrum. Now, this is not what Baudrillard has done. Baudrillard is not saying we're going to blur the distinction between subject and object. Rather, he says, as theorists, the fatal strategy is to continue to have the duality between subject and object and take the object's side so that the war continues. Because if you say, no, we're gonna complicate the binary, then it leaves less to be done. Whereas the more provocative statement here is to say, we're going to maintain the binary and then just declare war on the minor pole, the pole that's been dismissed, the pole that has been, you know, cast or put below the other one. The subject is considered important. The object is considered less important. The subject is considered agentic and active. The object is considered non-agentic or passive and sort of neutral, just waiting for subjects to do things with it. And that's kind of what we covered last episode of this. And the duality of subject and object goes a lot further than you might realize. So I brought up some objects that I think show that up. We're going to get to some more today, but the two objects that I brought up last time that show up that distinction are narcotics and oil. But the subject-object duality probably goes deeper and is more prominent than you'd think at first glance, because most of the time we're not thinking in a philosophical mode. But in terms of politics, the political options that are on the table, whether you're a lib or a conservative or an anarchist or a libertarian, etc., all of these agree apropos the distinction between subject and object, because politics is always there, a negotiation between the individual and the collective. So that's why I've said in a provocative mode or whatever you want to call it, that we're all just libs, because politics is seen as this negotiation between the individual and the collective. So the libs think, you know, we can all get along. The conservatives think that the ones who are already getting along can continue to get along and fuck everyone else. And then the anarchists and the libertarians want to get along as individuals without the collective as much as possible. But ultimately, these are superficial differences with respect to the fact that politics is, at bottom, seen by almost everybody to be that negotiation between the individual and the collective. And there are some alternatives to that, you know, like a Spinoza. If there were a Spinozan politics, it might be different from that. And maybe even a version of Marxism that is basically class determinist would also break this mold. But most people interpret Marx as a humanist because we're all libs. But the contradiction in Marxism is supposed to inevitably crash the boat. But I do know of one alternative to this liberalism, and that would be feudalism. Because in feudalism, there are perhaps states. There is an ancient regime, but states are not considered to be negotiations between individuals and the collective. Often there's like one individual, the monarch and the monarch's family. Plato's Republic is not a negotiation. It's a a head and then arms and feet. So if the king in this mode, the king is the mind, then the people over whom the king rules are like the hands and the feet. Then you have public institutions that are organs, but there's no sense of this being a negotiation. And that's what makes modernity different, because it elevates the subject to this position that is able to negotiate its power with the sovereign. And that ultimately leads to the death of the sovereign. But just think of the word, for example, the word individual, because the word individual means something that can't be divided. And it's pretty cute to think that people, individual people, there's the word again, but to think that they are indivisible, because nobody actually believes that today, despite the fact that we use it as a basis for politics. Because everyone knows that they have their public persona as opposed to their private persona. It's widely believed and accepted that people have an unconscious. So there's a division in the supposed individual, not to mention whatever else you want to apply to individuals, which shows that they are dividuals. Credit score, race, gender, dividuals. But once more, where the self-possessed individual gets challenged, or it's shown up to be something different, is with narcotics, for example, like global politics being defined by opium wars, or a country being defined by an opioid crisis. And the other, all the way from Afghanistan to the Golden Triangle, this is an agent. And it's kind of silly to think that it's not an agent of politics. And the other major example I looked at last time was oil. Because oil, just the fact of its existing, controls democratically elected governments. It determines global conflict. It causes wars, territory disputes. It determines which countries have agency. You're thinking like the Saudis, for example, potentially caused a war in Iraq. So geopolitics is not based on negotiations, and not negotiations between individuals and collectives. It's based on this evil, Baudrillard's term, the dark side of the oil as an object. So before we go to a little bit of a critique mode, let's look at just the beginning of an interview that Baudrillard gave. So this is going to be a review. I think review is always good. But we'll just read the first couple pages of this interview. So the interviewer asks Baudrillard, banal strategy and fatal strategy. What's the difference between them? Baudrillard, yes, this detour, this opposition is a little facile. As soon as one looks at it, it proves to be much more complex. Banality, that of the masses, of silent majorities, all that is our ambience. For me, however, it is a fatal strategy, something that responds of its own accord, something from which it is impossible to escape, but which you cannot decipher either, an imminent type of fatality. So what he's referring to in terms of viewing the masses particularly as banal, this goes back to Plato, and it kind of defines, mass politics, that the masses like stupid stuff, and that the elites or the philosopher kings or the people that really understand art and really understand politics, they are doing something above banality. They're doing something better. Marxism too, I think, in a lot of ways, applies banality to the masses. The masses don't know what they want. They're deceived and stupid. So this should be reviewed. And we see here the shift, calling it a fatal strategy, is then to shift from calling the masses banal to calling the masses an object, which is not giving them less power in Baudrillard's little scheme here. It's giving them more power. The desire to not change is a form of agency, rather than all these political theories that we are able to pick from off the shelf. They seem to apply passivity to the object and passivity to the masses. But Baudrillard wants to say here, it's there at the heart of the system, at a strategic point in the system, at its point of inertia, at its blind spot. That is my definition of the fatal. Now, mass behavior, mass art, Boberg, all that's the extreme point of the banal, the apogee of the banal. I had a good look at all that. Let us say that it's the kind of fatality which comes from systems of simulation and that which produces this mass object. So the idea here is to say that the masses, typically viewed as stupid, ignorant, and not doing anything, is actually doing a lot in terms of this term, inertia. Inertia is what resists change, and this is seen as something passive, whereas Baudrillard wants to say that inertia is active, even in doing nothing, because it makes sure that nothing in the future will happen. And I think my video on postmodernism was a lot about this. Anyway, we turn the mass, rather than something passive and stupid, we turn them into something active and fatal, something that has a fate, an end point coded into them, even though that point is to ensure that nothing changes. Yet giving them that activity is the reason that nothing changes. So seduction is also a sort of fatal strategy. It is the most beautiful example of a sort of fatality. It is something altogether different from, let us say, the banality of sex. It is a stake in another order, of an enchanted order. Whereas obviously the strategy of the masses is disenchanted because they don't believe things. The fatal can in fact embrace the two aspects. Which is to say, I guess reviewing last time again, this is something like autopoiesis. You can't call them passive because they're doing so much work. They're doing so much work, and it just so happens that the work is to maintain a fate that ensure nothing changes in the future. So an explanation of this would be, why can we not stop something like global warming? It's not, I mean, it is. It's because people are ignorant, but they willfully choose their ignorance, and all of these systems, with their inertia, with their power already in place, ensure that the fate of the world is to end in overpollution and eventually a bunch of environmental factors that can't be reversed. So the other view of politics, all the other views of politics that I just mentioned, whether it's liberalism or libertarianism or anarchism, the reason these things don't end up being able to change anything is because the mass power of the object. So we're trying to give the object its due here. And then the next page. He straight up asks, the interviewer asks, is it the revenge of the object? Yes, that's it. I've called it the revenge of the crystal. And I started out from there, in fact. The book Fatal Strategies crystallized on that theme. When the title came to me, the book was very quickly written around it. Of course, I already had many of the elements. What is the crystal? It is the object, or the pure object, the pure event, something which no longer really has an origin or an end. So this, I think there's a better term for this. He doesn't actually explain what a crystal is, but the crystal, again, back to Whitehead's terms, is the settled world, or what my pal Victor on the podcast calls habit. When something is crystallized, when something is settled, it's set in its ways, and it doesn't just sit there passively, it actively resists change, which is what makes it fatal. And in some ways, this is, here we go, the next question is related to this. But Baudrillard's response to 1968 is, we got everything we wanted. We got everything that Guy Debord wanted. We have the conditions for revolution, so why does nothing happen? And to just answer why does nothing happen with, well, the object doesn't do anything, is not to give enough credit to the object, because enough credit to the object is to say that it is passionate, but passionate for indifference. It's passionate about not wanting to change anything, which is what he says here. So object passion, that would be indifference, which is why this becomes fatal. It becomes unchangeable. It certainly is a passion, in my opinion, but an ironic passion. This domain remains to be explored, and it is not done in the book. It could be done by developing certain chapters. I have not done it, but I will perhaps write a theory of object passions, of the passions of the object, of objective passions. So what is being put at issue here is the notion that underlies every political option that we think we have, which is that some sort of awareness, some sort of knowledge will bring about change inevitably, which once again reinforces the duality between subject and object and gives all the power to the subject. If you talk about overthrowing capitalism, this is a form of the subject-object duality, saying the world can just be remade, like Graeber said. We could just redo it. Why aren't we not redoing it? Well, this is why. This is why we're not redoing it, because we're stuck in a crystal. And what are the aspects of a crystal? Where every facet reflects every other facet and not reflects passively. It reflects an active indifference. And there's so many little lines that could be connected here in terms of, like I mentioned, it's habit, it's the settled world, it's autopoiesis, it's the fact that what is wants, not actively wants in a conscious sense, but what is and the way things are functioning want to continue to function. And when it becomes on like a global scale, like an entire world economy based around oil, no one, not even a giant group of people, can just decide, we're going to overthrow the petrodollar. That's not how any of this works. And it's why we are stuck, and our stuck is our fate, and this is why it's a fatal strategy. So it's not to say that we're going to blur the distinctions between the subject and object, but he's saying that we should theorize the object side of this and show the agency that objects have. So I tried to do that in terms of narcotics and oil, but this is, in any case, why we're in the state of theorizing the object's revenge. And as long as you're dealing with a picture of the world as being settled and subjects manipulating it with their consciousness, with their reason, whatever else have you, that's why we're not getting anywhere, because we have the wrong starting picture. So let me introduce something to you that's new. I've gotten many requests on YouTube comments, even requests from you, to deal with object-oriented ontology. And we're going to do that. We're going to just touch the tip of the iceberg today on object-oriented ontology and why I still think that object-oriented ontology, despite despite it being a fad, or I should say, this was a big fad when I started grad school. It was what like where all the energy was, and this was like 10 years ago. I don't think it's there anymore for whatever reason. But we're going to look at hyperobjects, which is an outgrowth of object-oriented ontology. I'm going to offer a quick critique. We're not going to dive deep into it because I want to move on to other things, but I'll show you at least the difference between what Baudrillard is doing, which is saying, I'm just going to invert them and take one side, versus the kind of object-oriented ontology that says, well, you know, objects are kind of subjects too. Because when you say something like, you know, objects are subjects too, it casts or maintains the duality, the hierarchical duality that says we have subjects on top and objects on the bottom. So to say we have certain objects that are actually subjects is not to deconstruct that binary, it's to maintain it. So let's look at this. I remember reading this book way back when it came out. And dealing with object-oriented ontology when it came out, because it was like really a big fad thing. It isn't anymore. I was averse to it then, and maybe it's quieted down a bit to the point where I can say maybe I judged it a little too quickly just because of its faddish nature. But maybe we'll see. We're going to compare the fatal strategies approach to the object-oriented ontology approach. I don't want to dive into this entire book. If you are really interested in me doing that and dealing with maybe someone else like Graham Harman, maybe we can do that. But I find the word hyperobjects really interesting because, especially in terms of what I've called, you know, the oil shock, or even the petrodollar, or the opioid crisis. These are what this philosopher Timothy Morton would call hyperobjects, and the main hyperobject is climate change. But I just want to read. This is not the actual primary source because it's quite long-winded, and we only have, you know, a limited amount of time and your limited amount of attention span to cover this. So I thought that this, I think this is from Wired. It does a pretty good job of summarizing, you know, what's a hyperobject? Is this a useful term? And I kept going back and forth because I don't want this to seem like just total critique. It's not total critique. It's something that I find worth engaging in, and it's worth comparing with the fatal strategies approach because they do the same thing in interrogating or looking at or comparing the typical notion of subject, active, object, passive, and the way that we inherit this tradition and why it is ultimately a little bit too facile, as Baudrillard says. I remember the first time that I read this, I got really turned off by the book Hyperobjects because it had way too much of an academic vibe that a lot of academic vibes do have, which is, I'm changing the world forever with this new idea. And that kind of makes me think, you know, you're investing a lot into this banal neologism, and creating neologisms is really what academics try to do, because if you can get someone to pick up your term and to keep citing it, in this case, hyperobjects, then you have an academic career. And that is more or less what happened in this case. This article is going to talk about Bjork and, you know, the New York Times and the Canadian Parliament picking up the term hyperobjects and using it in like everyday discourse. So I'm not gonna say from the outset that I'm rejecting it, but maybe go through it a bit and give a few critiques on the way. And again, if I'm critiquing something, as ever, it's because I think it's worth critiquing. It's worth listening to. So I want you to, come at this with an open mind. Don't just take my reading for as correct, but look at what this is worth, and then compare it with the fatal strategies. Just because I'm biased doesn't mean that I'm right. Just before I start, the author, Timothy Morton, uses they, them, their pronouns. So that's, just be prepared for it, because on first reading it's confusing. But they, them, their. Okay. You might think in this time of profound human and climate trauma that the world is coming to an end. Timothy Morton disagrees. It has already ended, and not a moment too soon. Not because doomsday has arrived, Morton clarifies, but because what we call the world, a place that revolves around human beings and is defined by what we can see and feel, is simply too small to cope with reality anymore. Faced with massive forces whose impacts defy our physical perceptions, from global warming and extinction events to the COVID-19 pandemic, our parochial idea of the world falls away like the set of a movie being torn down. So this book was written in 2013, like I said, when I started grad school. But this article that kind of summarizes it is written during COVID, I think. So we're going to get some biographical stuff in here, which is good. Morton, make this bigger a second. And move my image. Morton, a kind-faced 53-year-old professor and author with uncannily penetrating blue eyes, has spent the past 9 years teaching in the English department at Rice University in Houston, Texas. But they are less known for their contributions to romantic scholarship, which are many and insightful, and more as a kind of poet-philosopher for our age of ecological crisis. In 2008, Morton was struck by a strange existential feeling, one that helped them formulate a word for phenomena that are too vast and fundamentally weird for humans to wrap their heads around. If you've spent any time on the more metaphysically inclined corners of the internet, you may have encountered the term hyperobjects. When Morton sat down to write a book on the subject in 2012, Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World, poured out of them in just 15 days, which is impressive. A 15-day book. So, examples of hyperobjects include black holes, oil spills, all plastic ever manufactured, capitalism, tectonic plates, and the solar system. Hyperobjects are often ancient or destined to be, like the sum total of styrofoam and plutonium we have littered across the Earth over the past century, which will remain for millennia. A human being may see evidence of hyperobjects. Pollution here, a hurricane there, or a forest fire, many forest fires, floods, etc., etc. But try gazing off into the distance to see the totality of them, or to the very end of them, and they disappear into a vanishing point. Hyperobjects, as Morton says, emerge only in fragments and patches that do not always seem to connect up from our view on the ground. So it's to say, we are scopically limited as human beings. Hyperobjects are those which go beyond what can be grasped. I used the example, my favorite example is the chair. Philosophers like to talk about chairs because it's easily grasped as an object, rather than what we're calling here hyperobjects, because they cannot be possessed. They don't appear within your field of vision. They don't appear as an object within the phenomenological horizon. So hyperobjects, it's an enigmatic term. one whose meaning is by definition hard to grasp. It often seems more label than description, but it's precisely those squishy, elusive qualities that gives it its explanatory power. Remains to be seen. The word hyperobject offers a useful shorthand for why threats like global warming are so difficult to understand or accept. They threaten our survival in ways that defy traditional modes of thinking about reality and humiliate our cognitive powers. Subject object. And humiliate our cognitive powers, a disorienting shift that sends many people reeling into superstition, polarization, and denial. Hyperobjects speak to the immense structural forces all around us and even inside us that we cannot see with our eyes but strive to comprehend through data or computer modeling. While they are not in every case bad things, the most talked about hyperobjects tend to be the most vivid and disturbing, particularly as they clip in and out of our vision like malevolent ghosts. Understanding these forces and responding to their urgent demands might be the greatest challenge of our time, and contemplating hyperobjects, while an often frustrating experience, can be an act of psychological reorientation. Once you grasp them, even loosely, they offer a philosophical escape route from the limitations of our poor little bodies, a way to make sense of a world that no longer makes sense. An alternative to the conspiracy theories and fingers in ears denials that have rushed in to fill the void. Soon, you start seeing hyperobjects everywhere. So, basically, it's an appeal to complexity, the author is suggesting. An appeal to complexity to say that, a conspiracy theory, a myth, will just divide a whole series of complex phenomena into good and bad, put themselves on the side of good, and it simplifies the complexity. The hyperobject is an appeal to complexity. Perhaps unsurprisingly, reactions to Morton have been intense and polarized. Hyperobjects, the book, and hyperobjects have been called pessimistic, provocative, disempowering, groundbreaking, disturbing, and just plain weird. At the same time, Morton's ideas have found a passionate and growing readership outside traditional academia, drawing in everyone from artists and musicians to science fiction writers, architects, and students. In the near decade since its publication, Hyperobjects has been referenced in a Buddhist blog post about ecological crisis, a New York Times op-ed on digital privacy, and a BBC report about how concrete will soon outweigh all living matter on the planet. Technology writers invoke the term as a way to talk about the incomprehensibility of algorithms and the internet. Science fiction author Jeff Vandermeer has said it neatly describes the bizarre alien phenomenon that he wrote about in Annihilation, his surreal novel turned 2018 movie. I think I saw that, actually. Is that the one with... Anyway, we'll move on. The Icelandic musician Björk has reached out to Morton to talk about hyperobjects, and their email correspondence became part of a MoMA exhibit. In 2019, Adam McKay, the former Saturday Night Live head writer and co-creator of a heap of hit Hollywood comedies, including, what's it called? The Big Short. I really like that one. Was so inspired by Morton's work that he named his production company Hyperobject Industries. You can feel your brain changing ever so slightly because you never even considered the possibility, McKay tells me. That's Timothy. Every page of their writing has that feeling. So, Morton has what every academic hopes for, which is to get your word picked up, to go mainstream, to get cited by Bjork, and to get cited by Hollywood producers. That's the goal. Then COVID happened, alongside an accelerating number of natural disasters attributed to climate change. And Morton's ideas got about as popular as is possible for enigmatic philosophical concepts to get. They even showed up in a Canadian parliamentary debate about the pandemic. We see something bigger than us, quote, something bigger than we could possibly imagine, unquote, says Charlie Angus, a member of parliament. Timothy Morton calls it a hyperobject, something we cannot even completely comprehend. That is the power of this pandemic. Desperate to understand or accept that they couldn't understand these huge interconnected forces, more and more people found resonance in what Morton had to say. Hyperobjects were certainly already here, as Morton wrote in their book, and slowly but surely we understood what they were saying. They contacted us. I really like that formulation. You know, it's kind of, though, this is being so pedantic. It's kind of irritating to mix like a Greek prefix with a Latin suffix. Anyway, I'm not even going to try to be that pedantic, but moving on. The message some readers heard in the arrival of these phenomena was a frightening one. Look upon our works, ye mighty, and despair. But there's another message in Morton's book, one that Morton is increasingly extolling as hopelessness threatens to paralyze so many. Our sense of the world might be ending, but humans are not doomed. In fact, the end of this limited notion of the world may also be the only thing that can save us from ourselves. Oh yeah, so instead of a fatal strategy, here's maybe the main distinction from a fatal strategy is don't worry, we can make a better liberal world out of coming to this realization. We're going to end on a hopeful note because we just are not allowed to end on a fatal note. I'm going to read one more section from this article. How do you tell someone in a dream that they're a character in a dream? Morton asks the first time I meet them. We are in the same small Houston neighborhood where I spent a year in pandemic lockdown with my brother. It's August and hot like Houston is always hot in the summer. So humid that walking out the front door feels like stepping into a blistering, slightly thicker dimension. Morton has picked me up in their Kiki Mazda 3, and we're on our way to the Menil Collection, a museum and art collection housed in 5 buildings, including a chapel across 30 acres. I guess this is a visualization of a hyperobject. Cool. Born in London and educated at Oxford, Morton, who moved to Texas in 2012 for the job at Rice, is soft-spoken but intense. On the day we meet, they're wearing a shirt covered in green leaves that fade in and out of existence. There's no way to persuade people in a dream to wake up, Morton tells me, as we set out across sprawling highways, the stereo blasting a mix of 70s prog rock, deep house, and shoegaze. You can't negotiate with them. You've got to blow their minds. People, I guess. People can't be negotiated with. They have to be provoked. Talking with Morton, much like reading their writing, is a slightly psychedelic experience full of poetic leaps and circumlocutory spirals through a dizzying array of topics. Star Wars, Buddhist meditation, romantic poetry, David Lynch, quantum physics, The Muppet Show. One moment they're talking about the planet death and the finer points of Heidegger and Derrida, and the next they're persuasively explaining to me why PM Dawn's 1991 R&B hit, Set Adrift on Memory Bliss, is one of the greatest artistic achievements of all time, and why Han Solo's Millennium Falcon is a radically democratic ecological being that announces the possibility of a new age. We're covering a lot of bases here. None of it is non sequitur, but the ideas can feel just out of reach, like a magic eye picture that's on the cusp of snapping into view. Because Morton so often talks about things that cannot be talked about directly, the only way to locate them is to orbit around them, gesturing with metaphors that almost touch, but not quite. Morton describes the origin of hyperobjects as oracular. When the idea for it popped into their head, Morton says, it felt like a radio transmission sent from the future. Not a fully formed idea, but a sense of waking up inside a stack of looming, massive systems that surround them and penetrated them. I was like, what the fuck is that? Morton says, as we slow to a stop in the midst of Houston's infamous traffic. So I hope you're thinking, and you should correctly be thinking, because this is quite a good writer here. This sounds awesome, and that's a good place to be at. Start charitable. Now we get a little bit more into what the word actually means. It's describing a sense. It's describing a vibe. And I think philosophy, honestly, is at its best when it's doing vibes rather than doing correctness. So we're at provocation point, which is good. The word hyperobject itself was not inspired by computer science, which is sometimes used to describe higher dimension geometry in computer graphics, but by a more pop cultural source, Hyperballad, an ethereal song by Bjork. In it, the musician sings about cathartically throwing random objects off a cliff and imagining herself as the forks and spoons and car parts hitting the ground. To be hyper is to be or to come from beyond, much like the eccentric songwriter and her music. I think I've had your music and words in me for decades, Morton wrote in one of their direct emails to Bjork. You have so many non-human beings in your work. Morton sees her as something of a kindred spirit. As Morton puts it to me, I think she is from the future. I try to be. Morton's frenzied 2-week composition of hyperobjects involves no notes and gushed out of them like sweat, full of tactile metaphors that try to capture the experiential strangeness of what it means to be inside one. I feel like Neo in the Matrix, Morton wrote in the first chapter, lifting to his face in horrified wonder his hand coated in the mirror-like substances into which the doorknob has dissolved as his virtual body begins to disintegrate. Morton, who had spent much of their early career writing about romantic literature and food, had already been interested in ecological theory, but now they were moving into an even wilder territory, a controversial philosophical movement called object-oriented ontology. Bum, bum, bum. According to this school of thought, everything that exists is an object. Forks, spoons, car parts, cats, America, global warming, human beings, and all objects are equally deserving of our attention. The stance rejects humans as the super special, only children of the universe. So this is, again, the subject-object divide. Instead, favoring a kind of equality between all things. So, I mean, this shows what I think you can probably anticipate my take on this. All things, all objects are equally deserving of attention, rejecting humanity as the super special children, and in focusing on an equality of all things. We are at hyper liberalism. We're at hyper inclusivity. Even objects deserve fairness in the attention that we give them, which is very much not what Fatal Strategies is about, right? Anyway, let me not bias you too much. As Morton looked deeper into object-oriented ontology, they realized it was part of what they had been thinking and feeling all along. They quickly became one of the most prominent thinkers in the field. I'd never been a part of a little group like that, Morton says. I've usually felt pretty different from people. Suddenly everything fell into place. Click, click, click. Lots of Morton's readers felt that way too. I said the word, and everyone said, "Can you please come to our school and say the word hyperobjects, please?" Morton recalls. It was a concept that everyone had been missing, the one that pinned down the overwhelming feeling of something so big and complex that you can't see it, even and especially as it surrounds and often terrifies you. When I picked up Hyperobjects for the first time during lockdown, I was struck by the holy dread that permeated almost every page. Hyperobjects were demonic, monstrous, menacing, traumatic, humiliating, and horrifying, akin to the skin-crawling, non-Euclidean monsters of H.P. Lovecraft, creatures so alien and disturbing that to look upon them could shatter the mind. It wasn't light reading, particularly during a deadly pandemic, while isolated in a strange city that itself seemed to be falling apart. This past February, a cold snap took out Houston's inadequate power grid, killing hundreds. Hyperobjects often felt like a ghost story, tales of otherworldly yet deeply familiar horror that I would stay up late to read. I wasn't alone in this feeling. Some of Morton's loudest detractors accused Hyperobjects, with its talk of looming invisible aliens and impending disaster, of being too bleak and pessimistic. The end of the world was right there in the subtitle, after all. As the academic Elizabeth Bolton put it in 2016, trying to sum up the reactions with scholarly neutrality, Morton's work is intended to awaken people abruptly, but debate exists as to whether Morton's approach is too harsh and disempowering, or whether it is the spur required for humans to adjust cognitively and emotionally to a new climate reality. It was a fair question, and one even Morton began to ask themselves. What, in the final analysis, was the impact of their work? Were they waking people up or just scaring the shit out of those who are already suffering? Now, this is the most liberal response possible. Like, don't scare people. Yeah, we're all going to die, but the problem with the book is scaring people. And just for the very, very lib sum, I'm not going to read the whole rest of this. You can find it yourself on Wired. But I wanted to really read the last two paragraphs here because, I don't know, I guess pessimism is just not something that you're allowed to leave readers with for some reason. Although Morton has grown to love Texas, they marvel at how often Texans seem to think their connection with the world begins only when you leave the front door, Morton says. If the radical, rugged individualism of the state and America at large insist on anything, is that our fates and our suffering are defined only by our personal choices. Correct. Not by invisible systemic forces pressing down upon us or the people and things around us. This can make us feel powerful and in control. Subjects. It's also what alienates from each other and leaves us ill-prepared to cope with hyperobjects. Perhaps that's why some people react so angrily to Morton's work, to the idea that we are bound inextricably to each other. It makes us vulnerable. But embracing this kind of intimacy may not be as difficult as we think, or only as difficult as we think. Realizing that we are all in this hyperobject together, potentially, ultimately, as modest hypo-subjects. Again, we're just mixing Greek and Latin, I guess, hypo-subjects. Does not require deep spiritual conversion or an arduous journey. We need not walk on our knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting, as the poet Mary Oliver once wrote, to exist in solidarity with other beings. We already do, and we already are. We just need to accept it. As Morton says, we are being born now, standing on the precipice, not of becoming post-human, but of becoming truly human for the first time. Why don't you just give away the entire game in the last sentence? Maybe I should wait a bit for my criticism, but I think you already know what it's going to be. So I'm really distrusting of catchy neologisms in general. And maybe we should just talk about that for a second, though, because Baudrillard, being a structuralist or inspired by structuralism, understands the difference between metaphysics and language or signs. Insofar as this person wrote about the original work, I have not read the original, like Hyperobjects, recently enough to know this, but it's saying that we need a word for the thing that we don't understand. Now, the point of a word is to understand it. The point of the word attached to an object is to objectify, to collapse the complexity into a single sign. So saying we're going to have words for things that can't have words is obviously paradoxical and isn't even what words do. But metaphysically, of course, systems are more complicated than we can understand. Now, what I'm saying is we don't need, the word hyperobject is just completely unnecessary. This is what the object already was in the first place. It's kind of like my argument against saying posthumanism or postmodernism is we're fixing a disruption and going back to the normal settled world. It's modernism, modernity that was the fantasy disruption, or it's humanism that was the fantasy disruption. And we need to get back to, the normal state of affairs, the settled state of affairs. So to say hyperobject here and then describe what a hyperobject is, like climate change. Climate change is the hyperobject par excellence. But then you're just describing a word as an object and then calling them the same thing. Because a hyperobject's redundant. An object is an object, and it's the modern split duality between subject and object that got it wrong. So now we have to add hyper as a corrective, but it's a redundant correction, which is part of the whole OOO fad. And part of the whole OOO fad is saying it's correcting the split between subject and object by saying, everything's really a subject and everything's really an object, which is not what Baudrillard wants to do. Baudrillard wants to insist on keeping the duality between subject and object, not to complicate it, not by just saying the world is more complicated than it might look, because everybody already knows that that's true. The world is more complicated than can be expressed by a sign system. Everybody already knows that that's true, or should know. I guess not everybody knows that, but, we do. But the difference between OOO and Fatal Strategies is he wants to keep that Manichaean conflict in place because the conflict itself is productive. Rather, he wants to look at it from the other side. We've looked at it from one side for so long. Let's keep it in place and explore seduction instead of exploring production, which is purely the domain of the subject. So I guess it's not a matter of correctness. It just comes down to a matter of decision. Because what the hell are you supposed to do with a world that is just spectrums and difference? You can't express that. You can't wake people up to that. And people apparently are waking up to hyperobjects and going, oh no, this is bad because I feel helpless. Well, goddamn, you should feel helpless. But Baudrillard's explanation, the fatal strategy of it, is you should feel helpless because the object has and always had all the power. So, in this sense, I think OOO is really strangely and weirdly Trojan horse moralism. That's to say, to be more moral is to pay attention to all objects as if they were subjects, which is like it's immoral to be selfish and only pay attention to human subjects, and we also need to pay attention to chairs beings. So, I would call this kind of a hyper liberalism or hyper inclusivity, which is to say, don't discount the chair. The chair deserves to have its being considered on its own terms. So, mild critique. But I suppose if you want to use this definition, hyperobject, I'm going to say it's a really useful term because the term hyperobject wakes people up just purely linguistically in a sign system, even though it's combining Greek and Latin, Greek prefix and Latin suffix. It wakes people up to the fact that an object is not just an object. Sorry. But this is not, I want to insist, a metaphysical operation taking place. This is purely a linguistic operation, if you're going to distinguish the two. But if we return to even the chair, which is philosophy's favorite example, the commodity fetish already says that this thing has always been, is and always has been more than what it looks like. And when it comes to the chair is already a hyperobject. There's no distinction between hyperobject and object because the chair itself, it grew up as a tree in Sweden and got pulped and planed and then shipped across the ocean, and then you bought it at IKEA and screwed it together with an Allen key. So, a hyperobject is just an object. But the fetishism of the object, and especially the terminology in terms of assigning signs to a thing, is what makes objects in the first place. So, don't get me wrong. I do like the term. I do like the term for its provocation. I like a lot of what Morton has said here in terms of a dream space, an alien space, making the world itself not seem like something that we just have mere sovereignty and dominion over. And in that part, the two of them overlap. The place that Baudrillard distinguishes himself from the way this has been described here, at least, is that it's not a moral outcome that we're seeking. It's not even a descriptive outcome that we're seeking. It's a provocation that we're seeking. And in some ways, both of them are doing that. So I do like the term. I like the term hyperobject. But hyperobject, as replacing the object, lies. It screens, to frame this full circle. It screams what objects are and have been all along, where moderns forgot what they are all along. I think ancient mythologies are much better at understanding objects than we are. And this is offering a corrective, but it's offering a corrective as if this is something brand new when it isn't. So, it maintains a new distinction between hyperobject and object to say that we need special terms for an object like climate change, which is not an object even, it's a process, just like any system. But to say that those systems are different from the easy systems, and the easy systems are chairs and trees. But they're all the same easy. They're all the same difficulty. All objects, if they are objects, began at exactly the same time when hydrogen molecules started congealing as the universe cooled. And we're only ever putting labels on that. So it leaves something to be desired, to my mind, in terms of what linguistics contributes to all this, and linguistic myths contributes to all this, because you can just scream from the mountaintops all you want, hey, it's more complicated than you think, about anything. But that doesn't help you think it. This is just, wake up and be scared, instead of admitting, let's play the game. So this is why I come out on the fatal strategies side of this, because I'd rather play the game. It's more complicated than you think doesn't answer anything. That's not a move in the game. That's not something that advances a strategy in either case. So anyway, use it if you like. I'll probably use it because it's a provocation. It's a provocation, just like the word postmodernism is a provocation that doesn't really mean what it looks like it means. So maybe use it ironically, I guess. But looking at the end of this article here, like if this is what you got out of that, I just find that kind of embarrassing, to be honest. It's pandering, like, oh, if you feel depressed by this, then we just need to hug it out. Come on, be more radical. Declare war on subjects. That's the more radical. Anyway, I think for today, that's a good length. I have a bunch more, but I need to finish the painting in order to do it. So I'm going to take some time right quickly here to chop it up, cut out the times when I'm drinking water and trying to get my thoughts together. But I hope this was interesting. The next one won't take too long. And thanks. Appreciate you all, as always. And I have my own little screaming object to deal with. In the next 15 minutes, it'll be feeding time again. So thanks for being here. This has been Revenge of the Object Part 2, and please stay tuned for Revenge of the Object Part 3 incoming. Peace.